This is the Horse Radio Network.
You're listening to The Stall and Stable Show, ideas for happy horsekeeping.
This is the fifth in a series of conversations that I have with Horse Radio Network show hosts about what they believe are best practices in happy horsekeeping. In this episode, I chat with Alicia Harlov, a hoof care specialist and host of the Humble Hoof podcast. Part of what makes horse podcasts so great to listen to is the passion of the hosts and their guests, and Alicia is no exception. It's a great conversation, so listen in. This is episode 87 of the Stall and Stable Show, brought to you by Lucas Equine Equipment. Today's Wednesday, December 15th, 2021. I'm your host, Helena Harris. Please support our sponsors as they help make this show possible. In addition to Lucas Equine Equipment, this episode is also sponsored by Tangent Materials, makers of tangent fencing. We've been talking about Lucas Equine Equipment for a long time now, or I've been talking about them because they're one of our first sponsors. But they didn't jump on board right away. They took a while to figure out whether or not Stall and Stable met their standards, really. And we've got standards, and so do they. And so by the time we figured out, hey, we like you guys and they like us, it was sort of a no-brainer that we came together in this podcast partnership. What is it about Lucas Equine that made me select them, that made them meet my criteria? Because a horse barn can be so much more than just shelter for our horses. And the folks at Lucas Equine completely understand that. Their job, their mission, is to create a custom design that reflects your horse's needs and your personal style. So what can you expect when working with them? What is this awesome service that everyone's talking about? Well, it's not just good service, it's what they include with their service. So pre-construction consultation, the planning process, recommendations from their experts. We don't know what kinds of things to coat our stall components with. We tell them what we want, where we are, what kind of horses we have. They tell us what's going to be best for our needs. Variety. This is a company that has more than 20 different types of latches to choose from. Now, some of you are wicked geeks like me, others not so much. But I could literally spend, and I mean literally spend, all day browsing latches. I'm fascinated by them. They are one of the most important pieces of a functioning horse property. And Lucas Equine Equipment gets that. That's why they have 20 different kinds to choose from. They have a variety of wood choices. They have a fantastic communication process. I talk about this all the time in barn management, that communication is one of the most important qualities in a boarding barn, in any barn, but especially in a boarding barn. Lucas Equine values and delivers on quality communications with their customers. So these are just like 3 or 4 points that went into my deciding to partner with Lucas Equine Equipment. You don't have to take my word for it. You can contact them at your convenience at any time. That's free. Send them an email, give them a call, go up to their website, see for yourself. If you're thinking about building a barn, renovating one that you already have, or you just have some design questions, they're there to help and they're really good at it. You can find them online at lucasequine.com or shoot me an email and I can send you their contact information. The saying goes, if you ask 10 different horse people how to do something, you'll get 10 different answers. If you've been following this series, you'll know that I'm putting that adage to the test by asking 10 different horse people their opinions about what qualifies for happy horsekeeping. Those 10 people happen to be my Horse Radio Network colleagues, all horse professionals in some way, shape, or form, and all with a similar horse-first philosophy when it comes to keeping, training, and competing their horses. This week, I'm delighted to welcome Alicia Harlov of the Humble Hoof. Alicia began her journey in hoof care by trying to find a solution to her BLM Mustang's struggle with navicular syndrome. What began as a simple inquiry turned into a passion and a new career. This former music teacher took her skill for teaching and her passion for hoof care and now offers both trimming and consulting services in the Northeast. Alicia and I talked today about how hoof health is affected by horsekeeping practices. So let's get to it and welcome Alicia to the show. Hello, Alicia. Welcome to Stall and Stable.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm delighted because I know so little about hoof health and hoof care other than what my farriers and my trimmers have talked to me about or if there's a problem. So I'm really happy to have you on because I know that you are as passionate about horses' feet as I am about their stalls and their barns.
Yeah, it's definitely taken over my life a bit.
And that's a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, education is something that I'm always pursuing. And then out of that overflow of learning, we just kind of spill into teaching others. And it's a fun cycle.
And you can make an impact on a horse's life by educating their owner.
That's the hope for sure.
So we're going to talk today about best practices in horse keeping, but with an eye on hoof care. Now, I know about you. I know a little bit about your philosophies. And I think that one of the most important things, at least I've heard you preach this, and I know that this is on your show, is that nutrition is a really important component to hoof care or to healthy hooves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something where I think a lot of owners, and I'm not saying that they're doing the wrong thing or feeding a bad diet. They're doing what they think is best for their horse, and they might not be aware of how it is affecting their hoof or how it's affecting their comfort over various surfaces. So that's something I do talk about a lot because it can be such a simple change, and it can make a horse go from being sore or absolutely needing shoes all the time to suddenly being comfortable over all surfaces just from adjusting their diet.
That to me is amazing. And the first time I ever thought about diet or nutrition in relation to my horse's hooves was when a farrier, a traditional farrier, pointed out rings on the front of my horse's hoof. And he said, yeah, you can see where the horse's diet changed.
Yeah.
I was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about, And so he described a little bit about how that works. Would you say that diet and nutrition is at the top of the list in terms of hoof care?
Yeah. In the last year, I've started to shift between diet as well as movement, but I would say that diet is one of the top two. And just like you said, where you're seeing those event lines from little changes and inflammation in that lamina and the internal structures, that is something that is, can be directly affected and caused by diet. So we can watch those changes. And when we do something and adjust the diet for the better, we can actually see that hoof capsule growing in so much healthier and tighter. And that's, I think, something that every horse can benefit from, no matter what we do to their feet, whether we keep them barefoot or shod.
And now there's a big movement toward a forage-based diet. Yes. I know each horse is different, and so their diet is going to be dependent on their particular needs and the particular health at that moment of their hooves. But would you say that moving to a forage-based diet is one of those things that's pretty much applicable for horses across the board?
Yeah. So I see before I got sick, I saw about over 200 horses a month. And every single client, the first thing I said when I met them, I would talk to them about diet, and I would start to talk to them about forage-based diet, where the bulk of their calories is coming from forage and hay. So this can apply to easy keepers, and it can apply to hard keepers too. There's forage-based options to add calories, to add nutrients for hard keepers as well. We don't need to just jump to grain or high sugar and starch options, which is what can cause that inflammation in the body. So something that Dr. Thomas Teskey, who's a vet, I'm going to get this wrong, aren't I? I think he's in Arizona, but he's a vet somewhere out that way. He always says that the healthiest hooves are attached to the healthiest animals. And I think that if we're feeding them a species appropriate diet where they're getting that hay from getting those nutrients from a variety of forages, that we're going to see a healthier horse in general, and that's going to grow the healthiest foot.
It makes sense. I mean, you're like, duh, why didn't we think of this before?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that, like you said, you've got a hard keeper and you've got easy keepers. And so their specific and unique dietary requirements will be a little bit different. But having forage be the primary source of their calories is a shift away from what we've been feeding our horses in the last 20, 30, even 10 years. And the more that research shows us, the more we can look inside of our horses' bodies and measure what's happening and compare that to what we're putting in their bodies, the more we can see where we're going wrong and where we're going right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So science and technology are our friends to that
right.
end.
Yeah. And if we do want to get a little bit technical, I mean, the most ideal thing we can do is get a constant supply of hay and test that hay and just see exactly where we're having deficiencies and supplement the minerals and nutrients needed to meet those deficiencies and get the horse, in a level where they're going to thrive. And I totally understand that not everybody gets a constant hay supply. Not everybody can, some people get a different load of hay every week, and you can't always test and have it apply to what you're actually feeding because it changes so often. So there are so many things we can do for stop gaps where, you're feeding enough hay so that you're happy with their weight. And then we can know through years and years of hay testing that hay is typically high in iron, which means they're already meeting and far exceeding their iron requirements for the day. And it's going to be low in copper and zinc, which is needed for healthy lamina connection. It's needed for good wall growth. It's needed for good sole growth. It's needed for healthy frogs. So most often, the things that we're supplementing to help these horses grow healthy feet is copper and zinc, amino acids, so they're able to utilize the protein in their hay. In my area, I'll often have to supplement magnesium, vitamin E, especially if horses aren't on pasture. And all of these things are going to help to meet the deficiencies we can assume is in hay, and also see a direct result in typically growing healthier feet. And I document time and again pictures of these hooves growing in just a much healthier wall. And it's like it's growing down the old hoof and the old flared hoof with the event lines. It's just slowly growing out, and you see it replaced with this much healthier wall connection all the way down.
And you're not talking about, don't let me forget, I want to go back to talking about pasture and testing, because we can test soil, but I want to get back to that for a minute. We're not just talking about the hoof wall and the lamina. It's the health affects the internal structures, the soft tissue, the bone as well, which, a lot of times I think when lay people like me think of a hoof, we're really just thinking about what we can see. The hoof wall, the frog, the sole, but it's the internal structures that are often the most problematic.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So that comes from the health of the animal.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, there is some testing. I have to look back at the studies if it's the copper, zinc, or both, but there is some research into the fact that those minor minerals can also affect the health of the soft tissue, of ligament and tendon health specifically. So, just ensuring that these horses are getting enough of those minerals and nutrients, you're, like I said, feeding for the whole horse. And so we're feeding those internal structures and the external structures that we're looking at.
Yeah, because the hoof doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's connected to all things. Okay, I'm talking to you, and we think like we kind of have the same philosophies about how to keep our horses healthy. Turnout is one of those things. The more movement, and it's just like people, the more you move, the better your body is going to function, and the better your mind is going to function. I guess if we're taking that principle of a healthy horse is going to equal a healthy hoof, how does exercise and movement contribute to hoof health?
Yeah, that's something that I've realized more and more over the last few years, is how much movement can truly affect the foot. And if we're thinking about the foot as a neurosensory organ, and Dr. Bowker has a ton of studies on how the foot is truly a neurosensory organ and responds to what we do to it and responds to its environment, we can think of movement almost like the gym for the hoof. We go to the gym so that we can build up our muscles, we can get stronger, we can get fitter. Horses move so that they can stimulate those internal structures, like we talked about before, stimulate the digital cushion, stimulate the frog, get that perfusion, the blood circulation going in the hoof capsule, bringing the red blood cells to the areas that need it, and getting a stronger foot from the inside out. So I've seen horses, and this is where it goes back to my statement earlier about movement and diet kind of being the two that go hand in hand. I've seen horses that are on a less than ideal diet, and maybe, I mean, I hate to say it, but horses that are on sweet feed and nothing else, other than hay, that get so much movement a day that their feet are still incredibly healthy. And, there's so many studies on this. The talk that Dr. Deborah Taylor did, there's one called Is the Hoof Smart? And I encourage everybody to watch that, because she talks about how environment and how what we do to the foot really affects how we can grow and change a hoof capsule for the better. All
right. Something I got to put on my list. We'll put a link to that. And anything that Alicia talks about today in this episode, we'll get links to it in our show notes. So don't worry about missing it. My hoof care specialist is, his name's Luke Tanner, and he's out of New Hampshire. He's fantastic. His approach is very, very simple, and that is to let the hoof decide, or to let the horse's body decide what the hoof needs to do. And his job is to just kind of take off the extra. He's not trying to reshape anything or create a hoof that looks a certain way. That a horse's body, the kind of exercises they're doing, their conformation will oftentimes shape the hoof to what's best. When a horse self-exercises, when they're turned out and they do walk and they do move from station to station, or maybe they're in a paddock paradise type of situation, what is enough exercise to have an impact on the hoof? Just standing around in a big pasture? Gently walking? Do they need to be worked hard to a point where they're sweating? How much exercise is needed to actually make a change to their feet?
Yeah, I think I don't know that I have a quantifiable answer for that, except that I have clients that have track systems, and which is what you mentioned with the paddock paradise. They had pedometers that they actually placed on the horse. So they had horses that just stood in a big paddock. Yep. They had their station where their water was and their hay was, whatever. And those horses maybe moved 2 miles a day, 3 miles a day, and their feet were okay enough. They're out 24/7. They just kind of ambled around. When they switched to a track system where their hay is separate from their water, their fencing is a little bit narrower, so they may be asked to move through areas that are 9 feet to 12 feet wide, depending on how many horses you have. So it's sort of like that pressure from almost like that chute feeling that is asking them to move more. These horses ended up increasing their movement to 11 miles a day, 15 miles a day, up to something like 16 to 18 miles a day.
Wow.
Which is a huge difference. I mean, and that's from horses that were already on 24/7 turnout. And the increase in the health of their hoof was exponential. And I don't know that I can say exactly at what point that got better.
Yeah. No, you said enough. I get the point. That small change in their environment created a big change in the number of miles that they were logging.
Right, exactly. And we see that time and again. And it does obviously have to do with how we set up the paddock and the track system. And there are some considerations there too, but it's an incredibly effective way to increase their movement for sure.
Yeah. What would you say for horses who are stabled? A lot of horses come in at night. Some horses can have 24/7 turnout. But a lot of horses in work and different disciplines, they're stabled most of the time. And, we can preach about 24/7 turnout or as much turnout as possible. What kinds of things, though, can people do for horses who are stabled more than they would like in order to help keep their feet healthy?
I think that's a big topic too, especially where I am. A lot of horses are at least turned in for the evening. So we might see 8 hours of turnout a day, but the rest of the time they're in a stall. And some more, show focused barns have less turnout, and, the horses are managed a little bit more and a little bit differently. One thing that's really stuck with me that Nick Hill said one time on my podcast was the more we micromanage our horses in terms of what we are doing in their stabling or stalling, the more we have to manage other things like their diet to get their feet healthy. So something that I always am very aware of is if the horse is moving less, then you're probably going to need to be picking their feet a lot more, treating for thrush a lot more, or being very mindful of their frog health a lot more. Have their diet very tight or as tight as possible, because they're probably not getting as much movement to mitigate some of the, issues in the diet that can be covered up by moving a lot and using the things that they're eating in their feed that might not be great. So if your horse is stalled a lot of the time, really paying attention to how their hoof is growing in. So watching for how the nutrients are affecting that new growth at the hairline. I really encourage things like body work, stretches, to make sure that the soft tissue down the distal limb is really healthy, not getting too stiff. And like I mentioned, picking out the feet and treating for thrush or treating the frog, even proactively, just to make sure that you're not seeing any of that creep up with less movement.
I'm really bad about picking my horse's feet because every time I go to pick my horse's feet, I'm like, your feet are awesome. Like there's nothing here. I have to check for rocks because sometimes we do have some pebbles that come up, but I'm always surprised that when I do have to check my horse's feet or clean them, that they are so naturally clean because they're moving all the time. I also have my barnyard, which is my sacrifice area. While my horses don't spend the 24/7 on grass, they come into a sandy area at night. It's mostly to preserve what little grass I have, but it's also to provide a little bit of an abrasive footing for them and to clean the feet. How do you feel about horses spending any amount of time on sand?
I think a variety of footings in general is really good for the hoof. I mean, not just for helping to clean out the foot and make sure that they're getting that stimulation, but also just the proprioception change, like asking the hoof to move over a different surface than it's typically on is, we're again thinking of the hoof as a neurosensory organ. It's getting that feedback from the footing that it's on, and it's basically adjusting, and, they can build a better sole callus. They can add in some wear. And like you mentioned, and I know Luke Tanner, he's awesome. I actually shadowed him before I became a hoof care provider. But like you mentioned, him watching the wear patterns on your horse's foot, having them in an area with some more abrasive type footing is going to show you where they're also wearing their feet. And it can tell you a lot about their upper body. It can tell you about their conformation. It can tell you about their primary biomechanical choices. Or it can be the first sign of an issue if you suddenly notice their wear patterns changing. So I think changing up to where they're in an area where it's a little bit more abrasive can actually be helpful.
So I think that's a really big deal, where the wear pattern can be the first sign of trouble higher up in the body. Early on, I did an episode with Dr. Bob Grizel, who's a orthopedic specialist based out of Atlanta. He wrote a book, Equine Lameness for the Layman. And he couldn't say this enough, and I'm totally in his camp. Finding the problem as early as possible is the key to preventing it from being a big problem, an expensive problem, a catastrophic problem. And I have found that hoof wear has been an amazing indicator of what's going on in my horse's body. My older gelding is, he's a little stiff behind. I can see the wear pattern change in his front feet. My thoroughbred mare has an issue in her left hind. I can see the changes in her right front. They're small, they're subtle, but that's where having a hoof care provider who specializes, I think, in a healthy barefoot hoof can really read this for you and say, this is what I see. This is what their body is doing. This is what's happening. And then I can investigate. I can call my vet. I can call my chiropractor. Do you see this in your practice? Now, before I let Alicia answer that question and we dig a little bit deeper into this part of the conversation, I just want to say thank you to Tangent Materials, the makers of Tangent Fencing, for making such a quality product. I am dying for my fencing to fall apart so I can replace it all with Tangent. I love my split rail fencing. It's beautiful. It's classic. It's actually served me pretty well in the last 4 years, but that's about as long as it's lasted. We're already starting to replace rails. They're falling apart. They're drying out. My horses are chewing them. They're scratching their bums on the posts, and the fence it can't handle it. The wood cannot handle it. And I'd really, really like to replace it with something that looks good and is long lasting. And in all of my searching, in all of my years doing this stuff, I haven't found a fencing product that looks as good as it functions. Tangent finally hit the nail on the head with that. So I would really like to suggest, listeners, that you contact someone from Tangent. It's not just about going up to their website, which you can do and is a great resource for learning about the actual material, the recycled plastic that their lumber is made out of. But if you talk to someone, tell them what your farm project is. If you're fencing the perimeter of your property, or you just need to do paddocks or an arena, you can send them an email, you can give them a call, or you can browse their website. It's tangentmaterials.com. Or if you send me an email, I can get you in touch with the right people over there. Okay, and now back to my conversation with Alicia.
If I see something that's different from the norm, like say I've trimmed a horse for a year and all of a sudden I notice that their feet are starting to wear more on one side, say they're wearing more laterally and they didn't do that before. I start to ask the owner some questions like, oh, did you change your saddle? Maybe it's the saddle fit. Did you change the way that you're riding? Did you increase the exercise? Because sometimes if they're increasing the exercise, but maybe the training isn't asking them to utilize their body in the most balanced way, it can affect their wear pattern. And sometimes I come to a horse where their wear patterns are all kinds of wonky when I meet them. And just through parsing out their diet, their movement, watching their biomechanics, treating for thrush, we start to see their foot changing to a healthier, more symmetrical wear pattern. And obviously horses with some conformational issues, like horses that have a deviation in their limb or in one of the joints up their limb, they will most likely always wear in a way that's not symmetrical. I mean, most horses aren't 100% symmetrical, but knowing that, and then knowing the individual horse, and it's going to be different for every horse, but learning what makes them the most comfortable and what helps them to move the best for that horse. And I like to use the wear patterns to tell me if we're on the right track, can be really helpful. And yeah, just like you said, I mean, I truly appreciate farriers and the knowledge that they have in applying shoes, because that is something that I don't have, except for, composite glue-on options. They have to know so much to consider all the different things that they have to put into a shoe to apply it well. But in the same way, in my kind of training, we're taught the different things to look for in a barefoot and what we can consider and what changes we can make based on that barefoot. So yeah, it can be just a different focus in our practice.
I think the discussion around barefoot versus shod is evolving as we learn more about the horse's hoof, about the inner workings of it. But, thinking about the hoof as a smart part of the horse's body, that it's adaptable, that it's flexible, that it moves, that it should move. I guess, I don't know. I'm always like, yep, you know what? You can't ever say it's my way or the only way. You can't say every horse needs to be barefoot or every horse should be shod. But I kind of think like, you know what? These show horses who have shoes and are going around on this beautiful footing, they're on sand that's engineered to perfection. They're in fiber. They're even eventers, even elite eventers. The cross-country courses, that footing is still manufactured. It's beautiful. So I'm wondering, why do we still need rigid metal shoes? I get composites, I get other materials, something that has flex. How do you feel about the rigidity of metal on the bottom of a horse's foot?
Yeah, I think that's sort of the reason that I got into hoof care the way I did, is, I guess one thing you can say is one benefit to steel is that it's very stabilizing, which, if a horse has a fractured coffin bone, or if a horse really, the foot needs to be immobilized, I can see the benefits there. And I think that I'm going to try to gather my thoughts on this.
I know. It's a loaded topic. I get it.
Yeah. And it's something where I've seen horses that are shod really well. I mean, we're really fortunate in New England. I think there's a lot of really good farriers, and that's not, we're lucky. Like there are some people that say that they have no qualified farriers within 50 miles. You know what I mean? We have an overabundance, but the foot itself, it responds, like we've talked about this whole conversation, it responds to its environment. And I try as much as I can not to lift that foot up off of the ground away from stimulation and not to restrict it too much where it can't flex and allow that stimulation to the digital cushion, allow the medial and lateral aspect of the foot to flex over various terrain, which can then give feedback to collateral ligaments. It can give feedback to the tendons, to the muscles up the limb. I think that allowing the foot to respond as naturally as possible affects the health of the internal structures as much as it does the external structures and the way the horse moves in general. It affects their whole body.
Let me stop you there for a second. I want to go back to the feedback with the ligaments. It's not just feedback, it's exercise, it's strengthening. If there is a feedback loop between the ground and the hoof and these ligaments, where you don't get that feedback with a shoe, which interferes with that communication, there's a lack of education that the horse's body has. How do you strengthen the leg and the body when you've got the shoe interfering there?
I think my main concern when it comes to that medial lateral aspect is, say the horse is how often? All the time, right? Trail riders are on uneven ground, or, eventers on uneven ground. And if they're stepping on something where there's part of the ground on the medial side that's higher and the lateral side's lower, if that foot can't compensate or adjust for the differences in the footing, then I worry that that's where we might see more ligament injuries, because the ligaments are forced to move in ways that wouldn't naturally maybe happen if there's a restriction to that hoof capsule. Of course, I've been trying to get someone on the podcast. I've contacted 2 people now to talk about footing and shoeing and how it affects the health of the soft tissue in various environments. Both have told me to contact them when they're not so busy teaching right now. But I think that that's something we definitely need to explore and see, is this something that we're potentially setting up horses to have more soft tissue injuries?
That's what I'm thinking.
Allowing that. Yeah.
We're limiting the ability of the horse's body to actually adapt to these different footing scenarios. I know when I take my horses hunting, it's the only time I put shoes on them. And it's mostly because with gravel, when you run into gravel, I'm worried about stone. So I just need that little bit of lift. Could I protect their feet with boots? Sure. I'm still exploring different types of hoof protection that are lightweight. They don't interfere. They don't change my horse's way of going. They don't distract me. They don't collect mud, right? All the imperfections that we find in hoof boots. Someday, I think I'd like to get there. Do you see anything on the horizon in terms of products and innovation that may give us the type of lightweight, low-profile protection that a shoe does without the rigidity of the shoe? Like horse sneakers?
Yeah. I think that's sort of why I went into a lot of the composite glue-on options. There are so many different options now in boots or composite glue-ons that typically I think that there's something for nearly every horse. That doesn't mean that there's something for nearly every owner. I think not every owner wants to deal with that. And I'm not going to force an ideal on someone else, but there are boots that I've used more recently. The top 3 boots that I say I use right now is the Flex boots. They're a new one that are very, very easy to put on and take off. They, in my experience with using them, they stay on super well. They have a really good breakover, which is something that a lot of people complain about in boots, is the added breakover. Yeah. And this one brings the breakover back pretty far. I would say pretty close to where the tip of the coffin bone might be, if the hoof is trimmed well. And they're really soft, which is a good thing and a bad thing because it can wear out a little faster. Scoop boots are really easy to put on and take off. Yeah.
I love them.
And those are a little bit more durable, I think, than the Flex boots. The last one that I use the most often is the Easy Boot Glove Soft. And the way that I use those is I utilize heat fitting. So I'll actually heat up the shell and then pull it onto the horse's foot and keep it on until it cools down. And then you have a boot that's pretty much molded to the foot. And then typically I'll actually turn the boot over and grind the breakover back on those so that you're not seeing, like you said, that change in the horse's way of going because of the way that the boot is adding breakover or changing where they would break over naturally. And then for people that don't want to deal with taking on boots or taking off boots, putting them on, there are so many glue-on options. I mean, there's even like too many to list. And those ones I find to be more flexible, but also add a lot of protection for horses that need it.
What's the downside to the glue-ons? If you're going from metal shoes to glue-ons?
I would say one of the biggest downsides is cost. A tube of glue can be as much as $80, and you can use half of that in some horses on a pair of glue-on shoes, plus the cost of the composite shoe, which can be $50 a pair for some of them, sometimes more, plus the cost of our labor. So cost is one for sure. Something I've heard from farriers that I've worked with is they're not as happy with how they can shape them. I typically take an angle grinder and just grind the composite in whatever way I want, but I obviously have way less training than a farrier in shaping shoes. So I've heard farriers complain that they couldn't do it to how much they liked it or how much they would have wanted to do it. And if the horse doesn't have that good diet and the wall isn't as strong as it could be, there have been some complaints of glue affecting the quality of the hoof wall. I don't know. I have, like I said, almost all my horses that I see are on like a really tight diet. And when I see a really strong hoof wall, I don't typically see it affected by glue, especially for prepping the wall well. But either way, even if a horse is in composite glue-ons, I still like to have them have some time out of them to sort of make sure the foot is feeling the ground, let the foot reset a little bit, get that same kind of feedback like we were talking about before, directly from the ground too.
Well, I'm always thinking we're putting nails into the hoof wall when we're nailing shoes on. Don't nails compromise the strength of the hoof wall?
Yeah, I think so. I would say that pretty much every horse that I've pulled out of shoes, I've turned to the owner and said, these feet are going to chip up to the nail holes. Don't freak out.
Yeah.
Like as this foot is coming back to barefoot, the foot will chip up to the nail holes. That wall is weaker there. It is normal. It will grow out. 90% of the time it's cosmetic. So it definitely does affect the hoof wall. And I would say that from what I've seen personally, glue doesn't do anything worse than that. You still have the same, you're either way, you're going to be at its worst dealing with just letting it grow out a bit.
It sounds to me like the middle ground, the most affordable option that offers the best protection and the best flexibility is a really good fitting boot. Because the boots now, like you're saying, we can pick something. There's something out there that can help our horse's way of going without really interfering with it. Like they're getting better with boot design.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many different kinds. I mean, I just did a podcast episode about the different kinds of boots with Sarah Hunt, who's a dealer of like every boot possible. There's, the performance boots that are really tight fitting. There's the pleasure boots that are a little bit more forgiving if the feet are really weirdly shaped.
Yeah.
There's therapy boots for horses that are laminitic or have navicular pain or any kind of issue that prevents them from being ridden or where they need boots for turnout. So there's a lot of different options. And then with those boots, you can take them off and examine the foot, adjust the trim if needed in the middle of a cycle even, so I think for my practice, I think that's ideal for a lot of the clients I work with.
Why do horses need boots for turnout?
For horses that I see that are booted for turnout, it's typically a founder case where they need that perfect surface under their hoof at all times.
So it's like a pain reliever.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. They need like that cushion under their foot just until they get past that initial pain and acute laminitic episode or something like that.
Is there any truth to the downside of taking a horse from a wet environment like dewy pasture grass and then bringing them into pine shavings for bedding, into a stall at night, and that, expansion and contraction between a moist hoof and a dry hoof.
Yeah, there's definitely some things that have been seen at the microscopic level, and who would be great at explaining this is Yogi Sharp, and he's actually doing a barefoot versus shod debate. And he's actually doing a few slides on that exact topic, on how going from wet to dry affects the tubular strength, that affects the keratin inside the hoof. And there is some truth to that. I won't even try to pretend to speak properly to it because I know I'll botch it.
I'm a lotions and potions girl. Even when they don't work, it makes me feel better because I'm doing something. Is there anything that we can put on our horses' hooves? Is there anything that actually gets absorbed? Is there anything that actually creates a real permeable layer? Anything that you recommend that works, and anything that you can say, yeah, no, stay away from that because that's just BS.
Yeah, I think so. My go-to for horses, especially if I've just pulled their shoes and they're a little sensitive, I love hoof armor, and I don't make any money from them. So I'm not like trying to be an infomercial, but I see it time and again work to help. It's as flexible that, it's explained as flexible as the hoof, but it's as thin as a layer of nail polish. And it just helps to add an instant callus layer to the foot. And it's antimicrobial in itself.
Nice.
So I've put it on the frogs. Typically I just do it on the frog and the sole on horses that I take out of shoes, but you can put it on, cracks in the hoof wall. You can put it on, just any issue that you see on the hoof that you want a little layer of added protection. And it's a Kevlar based epoxy with some antimicrobial stuff in there. So the main goal of it is to prevent wear, but I've seen it add, like I said, just that little bit of comfort as it's preventing wear. So over time, it's building up some sole depth. It's helping to get the frog a little bit more calloused, but it's stopping that exfoliation that if we don't want it, on horses that really need every little millimeter of foot that they have.
Yeah.
The other, there's a few other things that I might ask owners to do in terms of, even if a horse is not necessarily dealing with really bad thrush, I sometimes will ask owners to mix 50-50 of apple cider vinegar and water and spray it on the foot if we see a little bit of like maybe some microbial issues going on. Maybe if there's like little fissures in the sole or some junk under the bars, or the collateral grooves are a little bit funky. Just spraying that every day. I feel like even that, it's inexpensive and it's pretty effective. And obviously we can go all the way up through thrush treatment. But one thing I will say about thrush treatment, I tend to stay away from things that have a lot of added alcohols, or I hate to say it, but gentian violet, which is actually banned in a lot of other countries.
Yeah, that stuff is pretty harsh.
Yeah. Anything that's overly harsh, formaldehyde type ingredients. The main concern is if we're drying out that sole and we're drying out the foot and it's causing little micro fissures from drying out the foot, then that's actually making the foot more susceptible in the future to infection. So I tend to stay away from things that are overly drying, which is hard because I get it that a lot of times if you're in a wet environment, you think, oh, drying out the foot's good.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily.
My gosh, we've been talking for quite a while, but, and this is one of those topics where we just scratch the surface, and this is why you have an entire podcast about it. One last kind of highly charged question, and then we'll wrap up. When people want to go, I didn't mean to turn this into a shod versus barefoot discussion, but here we are. When people say, I've tried to take shoes off of my horse and they're lame. They can't do it. I always think in the back of my mind, well, you probably didn't wait long enough. Time is a problem. I want to pull my horse's shoes, but I need to be at a show next weekend or next month or next year. What advice can you give to people who might want to pull their horse's shoes, but are afraid of the time it might take to transition them?
Yeah, I think that is a concern for a lot of people. And I totally understand. I mean, you own a horse, they're expensive. You want to be able to ride. I get it. And that's why I like to label this as hoof rehab, like hoof rehabilitation. We're trying to grow the healthiest foot possible. And just like a rehab for a person from a soft tissue injury or a broken bone takes time, it's going to take time for a horse to get a healthier foot. And if you want ultimately that horse to be usable for years and years and years to come, then growing the healthiest foot possible is only going to extend their working life.
Yeah.
Typically what I do to prepare owners is, I have a very open conversation. I try to get them to adjust or look into their nutrition and diet before shoes are pulled. Ideally a few cycles before shoes are pulled. So you start that new healthy growth, calm down any possible inflammation in the foot. I have owners prepped with, it could take as long as 1 month for every year the horse was in shoes. So if a horse has been in shoes for 15 years, it's possible that it could take 15 months for that horse to feel comfortable. And that's not even saying that it'll be a constant, progressive, positive journey. Like there might be setbacks. There might be times where we learn what is actually a trigger for that horse to have hoof issues, to have soundness issues. But every time we eliminate a trigger or a possible issue for the horse, we're only helping that horse get healthier.
Yeah.
So I always see issues in the feet as a symptom of an overall problem for the entire horse. So yes, we can get that horse usable and rideable by applying shoes. And I don't fault anyone for doing that. Like I said, horses are expensive. You want to be able to work with them. You want to be able to use them. But if we're covering up that symptom, we won't always find the cause of it. So what I try to do, what I try to do is, let's grow the healthiest foot possible. If down the road you decide, once you have a really healthy foot, that you want to put shoes on or you want to do something else, I don't blame you. But why don't we try to get this foot as healthy as possible and then see what we end up with? Maybe that horse will become rock crunching sound for the next 20 years.
Rock crunching. I love that.
Like how great would that be if you eliminate all these issues and all these triggers and suddenly that horse is the healthiest it's ever been and its feet are the healthiest they've ever been.
And how much money you'll save. I'm always saying, the more natural that you can let your horse's body be, the more money you're going to save, not just in gadgets and gizmos and metal shoes, but in veterinary care and in body work and in downtime. I so 100% believe that the soft tissue health of any athlete, human, equine, canine, or otherwise, is dependent on their body's ability to interact with its environment. And I feel like a hard shoe gets in the way. It doesn't allow the body to interact with its environment the way it should.
And what's funny is that I tend to avoid, it's funny because this is what we've done the whole episode. Basically, I tend to avoid the barefoot versus shod debates because I try to look at it from both sides. And I totally understand. I get both sides. I get why somebody is like, yeah, but look, this shoe made my horse sound and now they're moving better than ever. Or, I see the side of like, oh, but look, now I have this really healthy foot and this horse is doing really well. Like I can totally see both sides. So I'll be the first to say, I don't judge anyone for whatever choices they make.
Correct.
It's just, it's kind of like two different perspectives. It's two different mindsets. And I don't know that everybody will 100% agree, but I don't think that we can discredit either side.
No, I used to be in your camp. I mean, same thing. I don't judge anyone for the choices that they make that they believe are in the best interest of their horse's comfort. That is all we want. And if that means you need to put shoes on your horse, metal, plastic, resin, glass, I don't care. Because you're thinking about your horse's comfort, especially as it relates to the kind of work you want it to do. Like our horses are in work, unless they're pasture pets or they're retired, we need them to work for us. So that to me is the most important thing. You're thinking about your animal's comfort and well-being. It's just the physics and the biology of it. And now having had major surgery to repair my own ACL, MCL, meniscus, and the rehab, the PT, and learning so much about how the soft tissues respond to exercise. And the more I see my thoroughbred mare, my off-track thoroughbred mare, whose feet were horrendous, and how they improved. We started out with shoes. We started out with some pads in order to help the breakover and help her stifle issues. But seeing her body respond to her going barefoot, and then how her feet respond to being barefoot, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. My gelding is barefoot. But like I said, I'll put shoes on him when we go hunting until I find a pair of scoop boots that fit him just right.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a place for it. But I feel like the shoe is a temporary measure for protection in a specific job that he's doing, not he needs to wear them all the time. And I very, very, very rarely take a side in when it comes to horse care. But I find myself starting to tip the scales more toward barefoot because of my own experiences.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, I'm there too. That's my entire career, but
yeah.
And it's funny because you mentioned your thoroughbred. I will say that one of my favorite things to do is rehab thoroughbred feet because they're so pliable. They can become so much healthier than we give them credit for. Hooves in general, they're so amazing. The fact that they are just this living organism that can change and grow and adapt is so cool to me. And that's why I became obsessed with it.
I'm glad that you did. I'll wrap with one little anecdote. I had posted a video of Susie and I riding one day, and she looked uncomfortable. She had some issues going on in her stifles, stuff that we hadn't yet discovered. We're going through the diagnostic goose chase of what's wrong with my horse today. And I got so many emails and private messages saying, is she barefoot? Is she shod? How are her feet? Is she barefoot? Is she shod? Are you going to put shoes on her? Put shoes on her. Put shoes on her. Put shoes on her. I was like, no, I'm going to put in a $30,000 sand arena before I put shoes on my horse. I don't know if that's going to solve the problem, but I would rather make a commitment to the footing and her environment than I would to really muddying the waters with shoes. And I'm glad that I did that because it turns out that it's not her feet at all. Her feet are very, very healthy. So I'm glad that, I'm glad it's your career. I'm glad that the word is out there, that there are other options for our horses, and that, transitioning them just takes a little bit of patience and expertise, but it's possible.
Yeah, I think for most horses in most situations, it can be an incredible, incredible thing. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Alicia Harlove, thank you so very much. Tell our listeners again the name of your podcast.
The Humble Hoof.
All right. And we will post links at stallandstable.com. I'll try to get some of those names that you mentioned, get links to those folks, and any other resources that we can share with our listeners that you recommend.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate you took the time to do this.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that went someplace I didn't think it was going to go. Maybe. Well, I didn't intend for it to go there, but how could we not have that conversation? I don't know. I'm a convert, sort of. I'm like 99% converted to all barefoot all the time. Back when I first got into horses, we had like one pair of hoof boots, and it might have been like Cavallos or Renegades. And, now we have all different kinds of options. That's because we have learned so much about what our horses need to have healthy feet, healthy hooves. So, you know what? That's where it went. And that's how these podcasts go. You start out with a plan to talk about one thing, and it just sort of goes its own way. Taking the scenic route, as I call it. With my brain, that's usually where these conversations go. It's never a straight line from point A to point B. And that's part of the fun. As I mentioned, if you go up to stallandstable.com, episode 87 show notes, I have a bunch of links. I've also embedded the video from Dr. Taylor's presentation called Is the Hoof Smart? The Adaptability of the Equine Foot. So you can have a look at that. It's fairly long, so make sure you carve out some time to take a look at it. It's fascinating. I'd like to say thank you to the listeners who have shown their appreciation for our show by offering their support. If you too would like to offer support for our show to keep it going, you can go up to stallandstable.com and click on the Friends link. There are a number of ways that you can support the show, both financially and otherwise. We're a small business and we can use all the help we can get in spreading the word about what we do. To content that's behind a paywall, in particular, I'm going to be chronicling the arrival of my new adopted off-track thoroughbred mare, Owner's Sweet. She is actually due to arrive around 5 a.m. on Thursday morning. So you may be listening to this podcast and she's actually walking off that trailer right now. So I'm going to be chronicling my adventures with her, the continuing adventures with Susie, and of course, Brody. All of that will be available to Stall and Stable friends. And just a reminder, since we got a little technical in this episode, listeners, this podcast is for entertainment and information only. So that means the conversations and the information contained herein is not a substitute for professional, medical, or legal advice. So please consult with a credentialed professional in the area of your specific inquiry. And that's a wrap for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it.